So oftentimes what ends up happening is the government will step in and they'll say, okay, the only way for me to lower this inflation is for me to lower the demand for the products. And the best way I can do that is to start making things more expensive for everyone else. Hi, it's Dre Griggs with Obsidian Wisdom. Today we'll be discussing how do you combat inflation. So we've been talking a little bit about inflation over the past couple weeks, and with good reason. We are considered in a time of 40-year high inflation where the Fed is now discussing how do we impact and how do we fight inflation. And I think it's important to really start with just some of the economic principles that lead up to inflation. So first, if we were to talk about the seasons, you guys know that I love gardening and planting and growing like fruits and different things. You go from winter to spring, spring to summer, and summer to fall, and then fall back to winter. That there really isn't anything that we can do as far as the seasons are concerned to change this cycle. That's just the way it is. And we have this same thing when it comes to the seasons or the cycles within an economy. So an economy, you can start in really any place, but you're going to have growth, and then you're going to have a peak where the growth is as high as it's possibly going to go. And then you start having a contraction where we may call that a recession or you may call that a decline, whatever the word is you would use. Once you have a peak, the only way to go from a peak is lower. You can't go any higher because then it wouldn't be a peak. So you go from growth to the peak to contraction, which is a decline, and then you hit what's called a trough. So we flatten out. It doesn't go any lower. And then you'll start going up again. So you could call that growth again. Now you may call that expansion. There's different words that we use when we discuss these economic principles, but there basically is 4 seasons when it comes to an economy. You are always going to have the same order of seasons when you're talking about gardening. You're always going to have the same order of seasons when you talk about the economy. The economy always after an expansion is going to be a peak. Always after a peak is going to be a contraction or a recession or a decline. And every time you have a recession or a decline or a contraction, you'll always have a trough and then you'll always have expansion again. These are the 4 economic seasons that we have. Now, when you're talking about inflation, we know that inflation has a few characteristics that are always going to be taking place. One is there is a tremendous amount of growth and expansion. And as a result, there is a high amount of demand for different products. And because the demand is so high, people start raising their prices. And also, that's tied to how much money you're making. So anytime you have very low unemployment, what ultimately ends up happening on the job market? People's wages start going up. Well, why is that? Because we're competing for so few opportunities of labor, where everybody has a job that wants a job. So as a result, the only way we're going to get someone to come to our company is by paying them more than what they made at their company. And then as a result, the company that you're at, after they start losing so many people, they realize, oh, wait a minute, everybody's paying a little bit more than what I thought we were paying as a competitive rate. We throw that word around often. So now we raise the salaries of everyone that works at our company because we don't want everybody to end up leaving all of this skill and all this knowledge. So everyone's rates start going up. Well, when everyone's making more money, what do they ultimately do? They end up buying more stuff. And so as a result, when you buy more stuff, it ends up becoming a situation where there's so much demand for my stuff that most companies start raising their rates. And we call that demand pull inflation. And I'll put a link to the previous video where I talked about the 3 causes of inflation. So when you have demand pull inflation, then people are saying, okay, I have so much extra money because I'm making so much that I need to now be able to pay all of this different stuff that I wanted. And so companies are like, okay, well, on the one end, people want so much of my stuff, so I should raise my rates because I can only make so much stuff. But on the other end, I have to raise my costs because I'm paying everybody so much more, so I have to cover my costs too. And so as a result, there is the demand pull where we're like, okay, I got to raise my rates because I'm running out of product. But then you also have what's called the cost pull. And that cause of inflation is just because my costs went up. So if lumber costs more, then your house costs more to make. If I raise the wages of all my employees, well, I'm probably going to increase some of the costs to cover that because I don't want to lower my overall profit margin. And so you end up in economic conditions where most of the time when you have expansion, because there's low unemployment, because everybody's fighting for these different wages, where we're trying to get the best talent, we're paying so much money. And as a result, now everybody keeps buying a whole bunch of stuff because they have more money. Most people in their company is going to say, we need to raise our prices. Whether we're raising our prices because of how much I'm paying people or raising our prices because of the demand for it, I have to raise my prices. And so as a result, we just keep increasing the prices until ultimately someone says, you know what, I'm not going to buy that anymore because it's too expensive. Now, more times than not, then you would say, okay, as a company, okay, my demands went down a little bit and things are starting to slow down. So maybe I should lower my rates again and go back to that pre-inflationary time because the demand is lowered. And so whether the demand was because everybody has money and buying it or whether it was because of the pandemic and we have, these supply chain issues where things are not on the shelves, whatever the reason is, most companies are very reluctant to lower their costs back down because on the one end, they're just not very certain. I don't know if we're going to have this issue again. And if I lower the rates, it's going to be hard for me to raise them again. And so I just kind of keep them where they're at to be safe. And then other companies, they just don't want to lower the rates. They're making more money, and whether or not that impacts the inflation or the demand, they're not really concerned because they're generating more revenue and they have stockholders and their jobs. And so they like that. And so they don't feel inclined to just take that away and give it back. So oftentimes what ends up happening is the government will step in and they'll say, okay, the only way for me to lower this inflation is for me to lower the demand for the products. And the best way I can do that is to start making things more expensive for everyone else. Now, we already talked about the four seasons of an economy. When you go from expansion, you hit the peak, and then you have the recession or the contraction. Well, that is usually where the Fed steps in, where they start saying, okay, we're going to raise interest rates. And that brings you to today. The Fed today said that they're going to raise interest rates again by 0.75%, which is larger than you've seen any Fed raise the rates since like the early 90s, I think like 1994. And their thought is, okay, if I make it more expensive for people to buy houses, if I make it more expensive for people to get loans, and I make it more expensive, just generally for any type of a loan or any type of way to get money, then I'm going to slow things down. That the customer is not going to have as much money. And as a result, they're going to buy less of a product. And as they buy less of a product, it's going to then force these companies to lower their rates back down because nobody's buying their products anymore. And so that is like the idea. So then it's figuring out where is that magic number. I don't want to just drop us into a deep recession. I definitely don't want us to drop us into a depression, but I do need to slow things down because right now everyone is ending up spending so much money and no one's going to stop until, we make it a little bit harder. And so that's where we're at. They increased rates by 0.75% today. That is definitely going to increase the cost of buying a house, the cost of getting loans. It's going to make it more difficult to get approved for even like cars and different things. On the business end, it's going to make it very difficult for you to get access to money. And it's also going to make it difficult for you to move the same products that you're moving as the costs keep going up. Now, ideally, it just slows it down, not all the way back where you lose all of the gains that you've had, but it slows you down to maybe like a year ago, maybe like 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, where the cost of gas and different things start going back down because the demand starts shrinking. And the money becomes more difficult for different companies to be able to access. And as a result, it ends up slowing the economy down to where inflation is back down. I think the Fed said that they're shooting for that 2% average, that's where they want to get us to. So then that leads us to what is going to be the danger of raising the rates. Because as I mentioned, ideally, you just want to slow the demand down enough to where things get back to maybe where they were a year or 2 or 3 ago. The danger is if you raise the rates too much, if you misunderstand and misread the economy, then you drop us into a deep recession or even worse, a depression. And so what ends up happening is companies are going to say, okay, well, no one's buying my product, but I've raised all of my employees' rates. I'm paying everybody so much more money, but I'm not able to cover it with my cost. So you start laying off some of your more expensive employees. Now, obviously, they find a very nice way of doing it where it doesn't feel like that's what's going on. But you and I understand that they're basically targeting people that are making the most money. So sometimes the company will just say, you know what, I don't want to fire anybody. Let's take like a little vote. You guys can see that the things are changing in the economic climate. and unemployment is maybe ticking up a little bit. Things are going on. Are you guys willing to give back a portion of some of the raise that I gave you during the high inflationary times? And sometimes people are, sometimes people aren't. And so then the company will then decide, okay, well, I'm going to have to start lightening up our expenses on the workforce. And there is the discussion, do you get rid of the employees that are making, this sort of a wage, or do you lighten up your management team who's making reasonably a much larger wage? Like, how do you balance that budget? And that's the discussion that ends up happening if you end up raising the rates by too much, to where you get rid of the inflation, yes, but you also drop us into a much deeper recession, where it's not just that people are spending less and the demand is going down, so the prices are going down, but a significant amount of people are losing their jobs because we've completely changed the economic climate to the point that the recession is very, very deep, to the point that people are starting to say, are we in a depression? And so that is the balance that you have to do. But there really is it's very difficult to be able to find a way to lower inflation without lowering the demand. And so that's why the Fed ends up increasing the interest rate. There is very difficult to get a company to lower their prices without them being certain that their demand is lower. And that ends up being also why they increase the interest rates. We lower the demand by increasing the rates. You lower the ability to have access to money, so you start pulling the money out, and you stop the quantitative easing, which is a very fancy way of just saying they stop printing money and just throwing it into the economy. And as a result, as the money starts to tighten, inflation starts to drop because people don't have the access to money. They're not spending as frivolously. They're starting to shop for cheaper products. They're not buying the houses as much, and they're not like bidding them up like 50% over the asking price, where things start to calm down and cool down a lot. But that is the dance that we're in, and it's very interesting to see where we ultimately end up at. So if you have any additional questions, you always can reach out to me. If you enjoyed this video, I ask you to like it, share it, comment. Let me know what you think as far as the 0.75% rate hike. Is that just right, too much, or too little? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, Wisdomites, remember, wisdom is asking the right questions to allow yourself to get the right answers. Keep asking those questions, and you will keep getting those answers. Continue blessings.